Welcome, everyone, to Franklin Noel's talk on the Nova Constellatio coppers. There we go. And go ahead and unmute yourself. Yeah. Okay, you can go ahead and set up your screen share if you want to get working on that. Then if you're good to go, I will turn off my camera and I will be here if you need assistance.
Thank you very much. And I can just, everybody's on that's on?
Everyone who is on currently is on. We'll probably still have more people joining in the first few minutes. I've been noticing that as a trend.
Okay.
But yeah, they'll pop in.
Should I wait or just go ahead?
You can go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Good morning. For having me speak, let me start by thanking the Newman Numismatic Portal and the far-sighted visionary Eric Newman, who created it, Len Augsburger, who has brought Eric's vision to life, and Liana Spurrier, who has managed the symposium and herded all of the cats who are your presenters. Today, I'm going to talk about my favorite Confederation-era copper tokens. They are affordable, accessible, and collectible. They celebrate the ideals that animated the American Revolution, and they are linked to the very birth of the American Republic. They are these, Nova Constellatio copper tokens. To fully appreciate their numismatic significance, we need to meet three people who are important to the story of this remarkable token. Let's start with Robert Morris. On November 27th, George Washington dined with his old friend Robert Morris, seen here in a portrait by Robert Edge Pine. Morris is often referred to as the financier of the Revolution. Morris, at the time, was one of the richest men in America. He founded one of the oldest banks in America. Morris had also been a Pennsylvania representative to the Continental Congress. In 1781, Congress appointed him as its superintendent of finance, which is why he is called the financier of the Revolution. In 1787, he had been a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Later, he would serve as a United States Senator from Pennsylvania, after he declined Washington's offer to be Secretary of Treasury. Indeed, it was Morris who recommended Alexander Hamilton for that position. Washington's 1798 dinner with his old friend Robert Morris was remarkable because of the room where it happened. The room was not the room referenced in the song from the musical Hamilton. This room was Morris's jail cell at the Prune Street debtors' prison in Philadelphia. In 1798, Morris had fallen on hard times. Wild real estate speculation had landed the man known as the financier of the Revolution in debtors' prison. On November 27th, the former president of the United States, George Washington, paid his old friend a visit and dined with him at the prison. Despite having friends in high places, Morris was not released from debtor's prison for another 2 years, when he was able to take advantage of the Bankruptcy Act of 1800, the first federal bankruptcy law. He lived the rest of his life modestly on the income from his wife's pension. The second person in this story is Governor Morris. While not related to Robert Morris, Governor Morris served as his assistant superintendent of finance, as he too was a member of the Continental Congress. Governor is his name, not his title. While the name has a French spelling, one biographer has explained that by the 18th century in the American colonies, the vowels were, quote, not Frenchified, so his name was pronounced Governor. Like Robert Morris, Governor Morris was also a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, where he served as chair of the Style Committee, in which capacity he crafted the 54-word preamble that famously begins, "We, the people of the United States." Governor Morris had only one leg. He lost the other in a carriage accident. Despite this disability, he was quite popular with the members of the opposite sex, including at times the wives of other men. The same biographer who tells us that the vowels in his name were not Frenchified also recounts a story involving a young Anne Bingham, who some speculate was Gilbert Stuart's model for liberty on the draped bust coinage. It seems that at a picnic outside of Philadelphia, Governor Morris and other guests were, well, drunk. Morris got into a two-wheeled one-man buggy. Anne Bingham climbed in with him. When her husband demanded that she get out, she waved goodbye, whipped the horse, and continued the journey with the one-legged Governor Morris. History does not record where they went or what they did. Anyhow, the Morris biography in question is subtitled, "The Rake Who Wrote the Constitution." Our third character is much less known than either Robert or Governor Morris. His name is Samuel Curwen. He came from a prominent family in Salem, Massachusetts. He was born in a house where one of his ancestors, together with an ancestor of the American author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, interrogated suspected Salem witches in the 1690s. Samuel Curwen was a Tory loyalist, and when the Revolution came, he fled to England where he stayed for 9 years, leaving his wife behind in Salem. Upon his return in 1784, he was shocked that his wife did not welcome him more warmly. Despite having a whole 2 to 3 hour notice of his impending arrival after an absence of 9 years, Curwen complained that she served him only a cold half chicken and part of a cold pudding. Less than a year later, he returned to England, where he stayed another 9 years, until after his wife, who again remained in Salem, had died. Upon his second return from England in 1794, Curwen lived another 7 years in Salem, where he died in 1802 at the age of 87. Much is known about Samuel Curwen because while he was away, he kept a diary and correspondence, which his great-nephew edited and published in the mid-19th century. A more reliable edition was published in 1972, edited from Curwen's original 18 handwritten volumes. So let's remember these three men: Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution; Governor Morris, the rake who wrote the Constitution; and Samuel Curwen, the Tory loyalist who left his wife in Salem for 9 years while he waited out the Revolution in London. We will revisit each of them throughout this presentation. Also important to our story is the political issue that dominated the decade following the Declaration of Independence. That question is, what are the United States? On July 4th, 1776, 13 English colonies in America declared their independence from England. In so doing, what had they created? A new nation? Or 13 separate states that were as independent from one another as they were from Great Britain? That question would dominate political debate in America for at least the next decade. In one form or another, that question continues to vex the American people. Even before the Declaration of Independence was adopted, Abigail Adams recognized this issue. In November 1775, she wrote to her husband John, who was in Philadelphia representing Massachusetts in the Continental Congress. In her letter, she wrote, quote, "If a form of government is to be established here, what one will be assumed? Will it be left to our assemblies to choose one? And will not many men have many minds? And shall we not run into dissensions among ourselves?" And of course they did. Some, like Abigail's husband John, thought the 13 states were to be a new nation. Others, like Patrick Henry of Virginia, held that each state retained its entire sovereignty. This debate dominated the Confederation era. One popular phrase, however, accommodated both views. That phrase, the new constellation. What is the new constellation? Well, the new constellation is a metaphor that aptly described the newly independent United States. Francis Hopkinson, seen here on the left, was an 18th century polymath who popularized the expression. Hopkinson helped to design the American flag. In the resolution establishing the flag, Congress expressly said that the white stars in the blue field represented, quote, a new constellation. The first numismatic expression of the new constellation metaphor was this 1778 $40 continental currency note seen here on the right that Hopkinson also designed. Here we see an eye of providence overlooking a constellation of 13 stars surrounded by the word Confederation. Whether, like John Adams, you believed the United States were a new nation, or whether you believed, like Patrick Henry, the states to be separate sovereigns, the new constellation metaphor accommodated both views. Like the individual stars of a constellation, the separate and independent states together formed a new nation. Likewise, when the Continental Congress finally agreed upon a design for the Great Seal of the United States, seen here on a medal struck to celebrate its 100th anniversary, the resolution adopting the Great Seal expressly describes these 13 stars as forming a constellation. Francis Hopkinson served for a time on one of the several committees tasked with creating a Great Seal for the United States. So what does the new constellation have to do with the copper token that is the topic of today's talk? A lot of ink has been spilled in the numismatic literature arguing over the proper Latin grammar of the obverse legend of these tokens. But whether the proper Latin is Constellatio Nova or Nova Constellatio, it doesn't take a whole lot of Latin knowledge to see that in English it translates to new constellation. At the center, there is an all-seeing eye of providence surrounded by 13 stars, all reminiscent of Hopkinson's $40 note, the American flag, and the Great Seal. On the reverse, we see the letters US for United States, a date, 1783, a wreath, and the words Libertas Justitia, Latin for liberty and justice. By March of 1786, these privately issued copper tokens were circulating as money in the United States. In March 1786, some newspapers in England erroneously reported that these privately issued copper tokens were in fact halfpence issued by the American Congress. For example, In England, as late as October 1786, this issue of the Gentleman's Magazine published an illustration of one of these copper tokens and described it as a halfpenny lately struck by the United States of America. The same magazine repeated the same mistake as late as December 1788. At least one newspaper, though, was quick to print a correction. On March 16, 1786, the Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser published a correspondence observation, quote, that the paragraph which has lately appeared in several papers respecting a copper coinage in America is not true. The pieces spoken of, bearing the inscription Libertas et Justitia, etc., was not made in America, nor by the direction of Congress. It was coined in Birmingham by order of a merchant in New York. They are now in circulation in America as counterfeit halfpence are in England. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Remember the question, what are the United States? In the 1780s, the newly independent states were operating under the Articles of Confederation. They had not yet answered the question, what are the United States? Coinage is an act of sovereignty, but at the time, money in America was complicated. Reflecting the ambiguity over whether the nation or the states were sovereign, under the Articles of Confederation, both the Continental Congress and each state was empowered to strike its own coins. Each state valued its money differently. For example, a Spanish dollar in Georgia was worth 5 shillings, while in neighboring North Carolina and in New York, it was valued at 8 shillings. Remarkably, in South Carolina, it was valued at over 32 shillings. The superintendent of finance, Robert Morris, seen here on the right in this double portrait by Charles Wilson Peale, and his assistant, Governor Morris, seen on the left, were among those who believed the 13 newly independent states were a nation. They hoped to establish a mint to issue national coins. A single monetary system with a single set of US coins would go a long way to establish the United States as a single sovereign nation. In January 1782, using arithmetic worked out by Governor Morris, Robert Morris devised an entirely new decimal-based monetary system for all of the United States that attempted to reconcile the fractured monetary systems of the 13 separate states. His plan was based upon a minuscule monetary unit, sometimes called a mill. A mill was 1/1440th of a Spanish dollar, which was the most ubiquitous coin circulating in the newly independent states. As precise and as ingenious as this system was, it still only fully worked in 12 of the 13 states. Morris was unable to make the math work out without a remainder in South Carolina, where the Spanish dollar was worth over 32 shillings. Together with skilled metallurgist Benjamin Dudley, Robert Morris created patterns for several denominations of his proposed new coins. By April of 1783, Dudley delivered to Robert Morris a specimen of the proposed coin. On April 2nd, 1783, Morris recorded in his diary that he had received from Dudley a piece of silver coin, being the first that has been struck as an American coin. In a 2017 article in the Numismatist, David McCarthy argues that this type 2 without legend 500 mil quint is the coin that Dudley delivered to Morris on April 2nd, 1783. 20 days later, on April 22nd, 1783, Dudley delivered to Morris, and Morris delivered to Congress several pieces of money as patterns of the intended American coins. We don't know how many pieces were several, but we know that today only 7 specimens of the Morris patterns have survived. A 1,000 mil silver mark, 2 different styles of the 500 mil quint, 3 100 mil bits, and 1 5 mil copper piece. It may or may not be a coincidence that when Thomas Jefferson returned to the Secretary of Congress the samples that he had been shown, he calculated their value at $1.80, which under Morris's proposed system could have represented a single 1,000 mil mark, a single 500 mil quint, and 3 100 mil bits. With the exception of the type 2 without legend quint that I just showed you, all of the Morris patterns feature the legend Nova Constellatio on one side and the Latin inscription Libertas and Justitia on the other. One noted numismatist has written, quote, "Few coins radiate history like the 1783 Nova Constellatio patterns." At one time, the Garrett family coin collection held 4 of the 7 known specimens. In 1979, when the Garrett collection was sold at auction, John J. Ford purchased 3 of the 4. At the time, Ford also owned one of the other specimens, this all-important for our purposes 5 mil copper piece seen here on this slide. As there are only 7 extant specimens of the Morris patterns, unless your pockets are as deep as John Ford's or the Garrett's, the Morris specimens are not really collectible. So let us leave the Morris patterns now and return to our copper tokens that also bear the legend Nova Constellatio. And let's address the question generated by the English newspaper that correctly reported that the copper tokens were not made in America nor struck by the direction of Congress. Recall, the newspaper said the pieces in question were coined in Birmingham by order of a merchant in New York. So who was the New York merchant? Well, based upon a quotation that appeared in Sylvester Crosby's 1875 book, The Early Coins of America, generations of numismatists believed the New York merchant to be Gouverneur Morris, the rake who wrote the Constitution, seen here on the left. More recent numismatics research by coin scholar Eric Newman and history professor Elizabeth Nuxall has come up with a more complete, if still circumstantial, answer. The man on the right is William Constable. Constable was a business partner of both Robert and Gouverneur Morris, who in May of 1784 entered into a 3-way partnership under the firm name William Constable and Company to operate a house of commerce in New York City. Newman and Nuxall suggest that William Constable is the more likely candidate for the merchant in New York who ordered the privately issued Nova Constellatio tokens. The Morrises were investors, passive investors, with William Constable being responsible for the day-to-day running of what the partnership agreement called the House of Commerce. A month later, they added a fourth partner, John Rucker, who resided in London. So now that we've identified the New York merchant, the next question is, how did the Morris pattern design find its way to Birmingham, England? The short answer is, we don't really know. But there are several related things that we do know. So let's try to sort them out. Remember our friend Samuel Curwen, the Tory loyalist who sat out the revolution in London for 9 years while leaving his wife in Salem? Well, it turns out he was a dedicated numismatist, something that was unusual in America in the 18th century. There are repeated references in Curwen's diary to coins. For example, we know that while in London on October 18th, 1780, he purchased 10 Roman denarii. On other dates, we know he passed on coins for which he thought the seller wanted more than they were worth. We also know that in 1795, after he finally returned to Salem following his wife's death, his friend, the Reverend William Bentley, wrote in his own diary that he had cataloged Curwen's coin collection, about which he wrote, quote, "Such collections are rare in this country, and in some parts utterly unknown. This is the largest that I have ever seen." Most importantly, we know that from Curwen's diary, while still in London on May 15th, 1784, a, quote, Mr. Bartlett presented Curwen with a specimen that Curwen described as, quote, a medal struck in Philadelphia. In a round compartment stands US 5, 1783. Round Libertas Justitia. On the other side, in the center, is an eye surrounded by a glory, the whole encompassed by 13 stars, with the legend, Nova Constellatio. The description leaves no doubt that the piece Bartlett presented to Curwen was the Morris pattern 5 mil copper piece. After Curwen recorded this reference in his diary, the piece was lost to numismatics for nearly 200 years. One was discovered by an English coin dealer in a Paris coin shop in 1977. Eventually, American numismatist John J. Ford purchased it in 1978, the year before he purchased 3 others at the Garrett sale, 3 other Morris patterns, not 5 mil pieces. So who's the Mr. Bartlett who presented the pattern coin to Samuel Curwen? When John Ford purchased the 5 mil piece in 1978, he immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was Josiah Bartlett, a member of the Continental Congress, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a future governor of New Hampshire. Years later, this Josiah Bartlett became the namesake of the fictional President Jed Bartlett on the West Wing. Coin scholar Eric Newman discounted Ford's speculation, and historian Elizabeth Nuxall has clearly established that the Bartlett repeatedly mentioned in Curwen's diary was a much younger man, Joseph Bartlett, who was from Curwen's hometown of Salem. Joseph Bartlett fit Curwen's description of him as, quote, young Mr. Bartlett. So how did young Mr. B, as Curwen sometimes called him, come to possess the Morris 5 mil pattern? And why did he present it to Samuel Curwen? And if this is the pattern for the model, if this is the model for the Nova Constellatio copper tokens, When, why, and how did the pattern get to die sinkers in Birmingham? The answer to these questions is more elusive, but there are still more things that we do know. For example, there are many different die varieties of the Nova Constellatio copper tokens, and there are 7 different Morris pattern coins. Professor Louis Jordan has compared all of the known die varieties of the copper tokens to all of the 7 known Morris patterns. He concluded that this 1783 Crosby variety 2B, seen here on the left, was copied directly from the 5 mil Morris copper pattern seen here on the right in this side-by-side comparison. He described his conclusions in an article published in the Colonial Newsletter in 2000. And at the risk of oversimplifying Jordan's very thorough analysis, his conclusion essentially is, of all the 7 known Morris patterns and of all the die varieties of the copper tokens, these 2 most resemble one another. Professor Jordan doesn't have documentation to place Curwen's pattern in the hands of the die sinkers in Birmingham, but he uses the known presence of the 5 mil Morris pattern in London in 1784 to establish that such a pattern could have found its way to Birmingham in time for the die sinkers there to copy the design to create the first Nova Constellatio copper token, the 1783 2B die variety. We also know that Curwen had acquaintances in Birmingham. Earlier in his 9-year stay in London, he twice traveled to Birmingham and visited some of the businesses there, including Matthew Bolton's manufactory, which would evolve into one of the most important mints in Birmingham. He also visited a Mr. Westwood, who in 1777 was a Birmingham button maker. We also know that Nathaniel Gorham, another member of Congress, overlapped Curwen's stay in London. Indeed, he and Curwen traveled home together aboard the same ship in 1784. Could Gorham have given young Mr. Bartlett the 5 mil Morris pattern? Did Gorham have his own specimen of the Morris pattern? Did Gorham ever travel to Birmingham? These are some things we still do not know. But thanks to the legwork of noted numismatist Q. David Bowers, who compiled the list, we do know that Birmingham was home to more than 20 die sinkers and token makers, including John Westwood, the button maker. Any of them could have struck the Nova Constellatio copper tokens for a New York merchant. So everything I've presented so far is drawn largely from 3 separate scholarly articles written respectively by Eric Newman, Elizabeth Nuxall, and Louis Jordan, all who accept at face value the March 16, 1786 statement in the English press that the tokens were struck in Birmingham by order of a merchant in New York. In 2009, noted numismatist Q. David Bowers also accepted these facts when he wrote his Encyclopedia of Colonial and Early American Coins. While I continue to subscribe to the struck in Birmingham position, Mr. Bowers does not. In 2018, when he wrote his book on Vermont coppers, which is about way more than Vermont coppers, by the way, he expressly rejected the struck in Birmingham view and wrote instead, quote, "I and a number of other numismatists believe that the Nova Constellatio coppers were made in America to be circulated in America. Among the other numismatists referenced by Bowers is Michael Hodder, who articulated the Made in America view in a series of articles in the colonial numismatic literature. Hodder notes the notorious unreliability of the 18th century English press and posits that Benjamin Dudley used the same apparatus, though not the same dies, that he used to strike the Morris patterns, to privately strike the copper Nova Constellatio tokens in Philadelphia. Other than to note that reasonable minds may differ, I don't believe we can resolve this ongoing debate about whether the tokens were struck in Philadelphia or Birmingham. So let's talk instead about how these tokens might be collected. I mentioned earlier that Professor Jordan had compared all of the die varieties of the copper tokens with all of the known Morris patterns to identify which variety he thought most likely was struck first. So how many die varieties are there? In his book, The Early Coins of America, published in 1875, Sylvester Crosby identified a total of 10 die varieties across 3 dates. As Eric Newman has noted, Crosby's taxonomy, quote, has not been superseded. Using a system he had originally pioneered in his study of 1793 large cents, Crosby assigned each obverse die a number and each reverse die a letter. These are Crosby's die varieties tables. There are tokens dated 1783, 1785, and 1786. There are no 1784 tokens. On the left, he lists the obverses and a description of each obverse, and on the right, he lists the reverses and a description of each of the reverses. For tokens dated 1783, Crosby identified 3 obverse and 3 reverse dies, calling the obverse dies 1, 2, 3, and the reverse dies A, B, C. Each obverse die was combined with a different reverse die to make only 3 die varieties. We can see in this slide the 3 tokens dated 1783. Newman, Nuxall, and Jordan, by the way, all contend that all of the novas, except perhaps the one dated 1786, I'll get to in a minute, were all struck in 1785, and that those dated 1783 simply copied the date from the Morris pattern. They were not made in 1783. Michael Hodder of the Made in America school doesn't necessarily believe that the 1783 tokens were backdated. In any event, we can see that all 3 varieties of the 1783 tokens look quite similar. They all have block letters for US, and except for these odd cuneiform shaped rays on the variety 3C, they all closely resemble the Morris 5 mill pattern given to Samuel Kirwan, especially this variety 2B, which was studied in detail by Professor Jordan. This all changed in 1785. The die sinkers decided to get more creative. Nothing is known about the reason for the change. Jordan describes the changes in detail in a footnote to his 2000 Colonial Newsletter article, but offers nothing by way of a reason for the changes. But for whatever reason, the die sinkers appear to have gone off on a frolic and detour of their own. Some changes were minor, but 3 were quite substantial. First, instead of simply continuing to copy the 1783 date from the Morris pattern, These tokens are dated 1785. Second, they transformed the block letters US into an intertwined fancy script, which is kind of hard to follow, but it's US. And third, they replaced the ornament between the words libertas justitia with the Latin word for and, et, liberty and justice. These are the 1785 tokens. For the tokens dated 1785, Crosby identified these 6 die varieties made by mixing and matching 5 obverse and 5 reverse dies. So with the 3 1783 varieties and 6 1785 varieties, we so far have a total of 9 die varieties. That leaves the rare 1786 variety. When Crosby created his taxonomy for the Nova coppers, he was aware of only 2 specimens of the 1786 variety. Rod Widdock, Nova Constellatio expert, recently told me that he has now documented 27 extant specimens of the 1786 token. So they're still quite rare, but now there are more than 2. They are all quite scudsy. You are looking at one of the finest known. This piece was once owned by Eric Newman. Like the 1783 varieties, the 1786 token uses the block letter US, which is barely visible here in the center. But like the 1785 varieties, it includes the word for and, et, libertas et justitia. Today, most numismatists who have studied the issue agree that the 1786 was not made by the same mint that made the 1783 and 1785 tokens. It is, they say, a contemporary counterfeit made by a much less skilled die sinker. Newman's 1995 article on the topic hedges on the issue of whether it's a counterfeit or was made by the same mint. But from reviewing his personal notes, which, by the way, are available here on the Newman Numismatic Portal, I think he believed the 1786 to be a counterfeit. Just last summer, in an article in the C4 newsletter, the article described the 1786 token as both a counterfeit and an oddity. But as Crosby included it in his taxonomy, to complete a collection of Crosby die varieties will require 10 specimens, including the rare 1786, of which only 27 are currently known. So let me close by giving you 3 reasons why these are my favorite 18th century copper tokens. First, numismatically, these tokens are the perfect collectible. There are many common, affordable specimens available, yet there are also scarce and rare varieties as well. They can be collected by type, date, or die variety. A complete collection of die varieties requires only 10 tokens. Second, historically, like the Morris patterns, the design of which they copy nearly verbatim, these tokens radiate history. Their design alone ties them to the very birth of the American Republic. Moreover, they continue to generate historical debate over where and by whom they were struck. This debate has engaged some of the greatest minds working in numismatics and continues unresolved. Third, metaphorically, and most importantly, these tokens fully answer the question that has vexed the American people for nearly 250 years. what are the United States? With 4 Latin words and 2 letters, these copper tokens tell us that, like a new constellation made up of several individual stars, the United States is a nation made up of individual states. Further, the token tells us that the United States, from its beginning, is dedicated to liberty and justice, an aspiration that was certainly not accomplished at the founding, nor yet today. But even as these twin goals continue to elude us, the hope of achieving them has kept the American people moving, however circuitously, toward their attainment. As Dr. King often said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So too does the new constellation. So here are my references. Everything I've told you and much more can be found there. I will leave this slide up while I try to address any questions that anyone might have. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak and for your time and attention.
Okay, we do have a few questions here. Okay, you call these tokens, not coins. So the Morse patterns are the first US coins. These are tokens, and the Fujio coppers are the first US coin used for circulation. Is this correct?
Yes, I have to think carefully about the wording of the question. So yes, these are tokens, they are not coins. The Morse coins are pattern coins. They never circulated either. There was only 7 of them that are extant, and they didn't see wide dispersal. They were limited, I think, to members of Congress. The Fujio cents are the first US cent, but just to be clear, the state of Massachusetts minted cents and half cents, which are called cents and half cents, before the Fujio cents were minted. So the very first cent and half cent are the Massachusetts cent and half cent. And the Fujio, though, is the first US cent, again, reflecting the ambiguity under the Articles of the Confederation over whether the nation or the states were sovereign.
Okay. What kind of prices do the 1786s bring?
Anywhere from under 1,000 to the piece I showed you sold in 2014 for $21,000.
Well, with that few examples, I'm surprised that any of them are below 1,000.
Well, some of them are really bad. I mean, that one was really bad, but some of them are even worse. Mm-hmm. And the interest in them, which is, the demand side of the equation, ebbs and flows. And at the time that the Newman piece was up for auction, there was very high interest. The ones that sold for less than 1,000 were at a time when there wasn't a lot of interest in Nova Constellatio tokens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A. Feel free to send in more questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And okay, let's see. What is the typical strike and planchet quality like for these? Are they commonly found well struck, or is that unusual?
The 1785s and the 1783s, in particular the 1783 2B and 3C, all come very well struck and are available in any number of, or a whole range of grades. The 1786s, as I said, I think the one I showed you, the Newman piece, is one of the finest known. There's another one that looks very similar to that, but they're all, the strike and everything is bad. But the 1785s and the 1783s, they're very nice, and some come uncirculated, and some you get them more reasonably if you get, fine or very fine or good examples.
Okay, well, that's all we currently have in the Q&A. So go ahead and submit something promptly if you had any other questions. In the meantime, is there anything that you would like to add to close with?
just again to thank you for putting this together, to thank Len for bringing Eric's vision to life at the Newman Numismatic Portal, and to thank Eric for his 100+ years of life and dedication to numismatics and for creating this remarkable resource.
And thank you for giving this presentation. Let's see, we don't have anything else new coming in, so I believe that wraps this up. Thank you for everyone who came in and listened. The next one we have going is Douglas Mudd starting at noon, so that one should be up and you can go ahead and join in if you want to watch that one. So that wraps us up here. Hope to see everyone back at more presentations throughout the symposium. And thank you, Franklin.
Thank you.